Okay, so hello, welcome. I'm Elke Schüßler. I'm professor of business administration at Johannes Kepler University Linz in Austria.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ashwin. I'm a professor of comparative employment relations in the Department of Management at the London School of Economics.
And today we want to talk about a paper that we wrote in the context of a larger research project we conducted, examining the responses to Rana Plaza factory disaster in the garment industry to see whether there were any developments in supply chain governance that would help the improvement of labor standards in the industry. And this is just one bit of our research and we focus on an initiative that was actually not concluded in direct response to Rana Plaza, but of course in the aftermath of Rana Plaza, is collective action initiative driven by brands as well as global union federations to tackle the issue of living wages. We co-wrote the paper together with the they also say hi. So let me start by telling you a little bit about what the problem is of living wages in supply chains more generally, but also in the context of contemplations. So generally, a living wage is a wage that is paid for a standard working week that meets the basic needs of workers and families, but also provides some discretionary income, okay? And that typically means that this living wage is a bit more than what the national minimum wage in many countries. So in Bangladesh, that was the context we studied. But the living wage calculations are typically a bit above that. The minimum wage is not considered to actually provide this discretionary income and not even to provide the basic needs of workers. And so the national minimum wage is more than $50. The lowest estimated living wage by the federal would be so almost double of. However, it's actually not so clear how to best calculate a living wage, and there are various estimates. The highest estimate for is the low wage allowance, and it's about $450. Of course, if we look at it from a sort of industrialized Western global North perspective, it doesn't seem like a huge amount of money. So the question is always why does it difficult for factories for living wages, and of course that has to be seen in relation to the prices they're paid by their buyers. Again, the question is, so why can't we just make the garment products just a little bit more expensive? Consumers would pay like 5 cents more per item, and that would then, if that was passed on to workers, it would translate into filling this gap in minimum wage and wage. But that is not so easy. And again, here's a calculation by the Fairwear Foundation that tries to illustrate what happens. So let's take a t-shirt, 29 euros retail price. Here's a breakdown, and we see already that the labor share of that price is very little. It's 18 cents. And for a living wage, it's just an estimate. Yeah. But for a living wage, that share of the cost would have to rise to about 45 cents. Now, if we just would pass that on directly, it would mean the price of the t-shirt would be 29 and something like 30 cents. Now, what the Fairwear Foundation shows is that that's not how it's calculated. The prices escalate in proportion to volumes and not directly. So the retail price here would actually rise to 30 euros and 45 cents. And that for retailers is too much, because they say, well, the magical line is 30 euros. If the t-shirt is below, we have a higher percentage of people buying it. And if the price would be above that magic threshold of 30, the number of people buying it would actually drop significantly. So this indicates that the garment brands and retailers that compete very intensively on a cost basis just able to increase unilaterally, even if it's just a small percentage. So it's a collective action problem, and the brands and retailers themselves actually recognize this. We all know that many initiatives, codes of conduct, but also multi-stakeholder initiatives, all commit themselves to a payment of living wages. But so far, it just hasn't happened. And here's a quote by an H&M representative who said, "The reason why it hasn't happened is that we all share suppliers of factories, and the factory workers receive the same so we need to actually work together and all agree to raising wages and, in conclusion, raising prices to a certain level." Now, what usually happens in such situations on a national level is to have something like collective bargaining. That's a mechanism we have in place in many countries where it's legal, and that makes take waste out of the competition. So this is really what it's about here. It's to agree to a certain price level that is not to be undercut by competitors when it comes to wages and labor costs. That mechanism, of course, does not exist on a transnational level in the context of global supply chain. So that's the kind of dilemma we're dealing with here. Okay, so I hand over to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Elke. So, in response to this problem, a new initiative was founded known as ACT, Action, Collaboration, Transformation. It was co-founded in 2015 by the Industrial Global Union and 15 leading garment brands, such as, for example, H&M, Inditex, Primark, all key members of the organisation. And their idea was to add wages to safety as a so-called pre-competitive issue, taking it out of competition in precisely the way that Elke was just talking about. The idea of how this would be done would be that they would establish, they would try to encourage employers and union organisations in producer countries to establish collective bargaining agreements. And then once those agreements were concluded, the brands would sign agreements with the suppliers who were party to those collective bargaining agreements in order to guarantee that they would continue sourcing from those suppliers, because obviously those suppliers, by signing up to a collective bargaining agreement, that would potentially raise their costs. So it's very important to have these agreements in terms of continued sourcing. That was also a part of another agreement we'll talk about later called the Bangladesh Accord. So this then sets a level playing field for the factory managers who can rely on the sourcing of the signatory brands of ACT. And alongside that, the signatories, the brand signatories, they agree to certain standards in their purchasing practice to try and ensure that their purchasing practices don't undercut decent labour standards, in particular the living wage. So that's the idea of how the agreement works. Just to be clear, the brands themselves are not parties to these collective agreements. They are just encouraging the employers, the suppliers, to get to the bargaining table. Meanwhile, on the union side, Industrial, the global union, is trying to encourage its affiliates or unions in the country to sign the collective bargaining agreement. So essentially, both sides of the ACT agreement are trying to create stable collective bargaining institutions in the producer countries. And you can see there some of the countries that they're hoping to establish this system in. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Myanmar, Pakistan, Turkey and Vietnam are potential pilot countries for this system. I should say that in none of them is it yet in operation, but this is the plan that they would like to do once they get enough members to enact the process. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to explain how governance has worked in the garment industry so far, we've created this these 4 quadrants. We've got on our 2 axes. First of all, we've got the dimension of union inclusivity versus exclusivity, or not including unions, and then single firm, multiple firm. Now, if we start in the bottom left-hand corner quadrant, here we've got codes of conduct enacted by single firms, individual firms. These began to be established in the 1990s. Typically, they were in response to either trade union mobilization in producer countries, such as unions in Indonesia in the 1990s. We were dealing with production of Nike, or campaigns by anti-sweatshop activists. So initially, the response of brands in relation to this was just to create their own codes of conduct and said, okay, we'll be good. Then, however, that didn't prove to be enough. And so gradually you got the establishment of industry-led initiatives where brands came together to try and set more common standards. So some of those, one example would be the Fair Labour Association, another one would be the Business Social Compliance Initiative. But these, again, often did not include trade unions, so they fall in the union exclusive category in that top left-hand corner. However, then you also, at the same time, actually the first brand union agreement was in the late 1980s, so-called global framework agreements. Those are agreements between multinational firms and global unions, and they set conditions, and usually what they include is core labour standards, so freedom of association, right to collective bargaining, no child labour, no forced labour, and then a variety of other provisions which should be respected throughout that brand's operation. So, as I say, they began to be signed from the late 1980s. But the real innovation that has taken off since the Bangladesh Accord is this idea of multi-firm transnational industrial relations initiatives. So it's not the first, but a very significant one of this is the Bangladesh Accord, which was signed in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza factory collapse. So what it was an agreement on safety, and it was signed by over 220 brands and 2 global unions, Industrial and the Uni Global Union, came together to sign that agreement, and they established very, first of all, it was a legally binding agreement, and it also established a clear and very transparent inspection regime within Bangladesh, and it lasted for 5 years. It was followed up by a transitional accord. Act, we put that within the same quadrant as this because it's an agreement between multiple brands and one, in this case, one global union, again, the Industrial Global Union. The first of these actually was the protocol agreements, which were freedom of association agreements. They happened in the late 2000s in response to particular scandals. If we're thinking more generally about the union inclusive initiatives, you can also, overlapping between the industry-led initiatives and the multi-firm TIRAS, you have some labour-inclusive multi-stakeholder initiatives. So one example of that would be the UK-based Ethical Trading Initiative. Another would be the Fairware Foundation. So I think that's the landscape. Just to give you the definition, the formal definition that we use to describe TIRAS, transnational industrial relations agreements. We call them governance mechanisms in which unions, local or global, and multinational corporations engage in joint regulation of labour standards through signing a mutual agreement. So they're the negotiated result of interest representation for the pursuit of global labour relations. That's Helfen and Ficht's definition. So we're going to show you in the rest of the presentation why we think that these multi-firm TIRAS are potentially a transformative model of labour governance in global supply chains.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's not just us who would say this, especially looking at the Accord, which is the most studied TIRA. Okay, this kind of governance model might actually help us to address these collective action problems that we have in global supply chains, particularly those relating to labor standards. Yeah, because they essentially address two problems that previous initiatives typically were not collective enough, and they were not including worker representatives. And of course, issues relating to decent work and standards to include labor in one way or other. So while these are hailed as a potentially new private governance model, what we argue what we don't understand yet is how these TIRAS are formed. And of course, there's much literature already on the emergence of private governance and CSR. And the issues highlighted here are, of course, the strategy and by grants. This often result from a process of political conversation by consumer groups, especially on brands, and then brands realize, okay, we have to do something to avert this reputational damage, and the result of that in the past is industry-led initiatives. We don't know so much about how TIRAS form. We do know a little bit now from research on global framework agreements, because these have been around for longer periods of time. And essentially, there were two factors or mechanisms identified. One is the role played by home country unions and home country institutions. So, for instance, Markus Helfen and colleagues studied quite intensively. I was also involved in one of the years, like comparison to German firms and how they develop framework agreements, the process behind it, and also the nature of the agreement itself. And we found that it mattered a lot, but used in the home country multinational corporations had strong influence and also like strong relations to the management in these corporations. And if those relations were there, the unions were kind of able to leverage those and push the multinational corporations into signing framework agreements. Second driver was focusing events. So catastrophes like the Rana Plaza disaster. And again, we had many factory disasters, unfortunately, already before that. And the first framework agreement signed in the garment industry by Inditex actually was and the Spectrum factory collapse again in Bangladesh in 2005. That's a case studied by Miller, who can link so Inditex came to this disaster that they were facing. And in the Accord, we have a similar story here. That's a case described by Juliane Reinecke and Jimmy Donneke, who outlined the situation, and that actually already had a couple of brands that were working together with Industrial and propagated an initiative to say, okay, we need to do something about being safe in Bangladesh. The factory is not safe. Let's do something collectively. No one else was interested. It was only due to this horrible disaster that had to happen that other brands were actually pushed into supporting what ended up becoming the Accord. And the sort of gap in our understanding that we identify is that this ACT initiative that we talked about did not result out of a focusing event. Yes, there was Rana Plaza, but it was a while back, and the issue of building safety was already handled. So there was not an immediate need to actually do something about living wages. Of course, the role of voluntary unions in this global supply chain context is not strong, especially when it comes to collective initiatives. So voluntary unions have leveraged over the multinational corporation they relate to, but of course they don't have influence over other corporations, and less those based in other countries. So our research question in this paper was really, how do collective and union inclusive governance initiatives develop the absence of in order to address this question, we drew on a lot of data that we had collected in the context of our research project. We actually interviewed all founding members of ACT. Since most of the founding members, with the exception of Inditex and H&M, were based in either the UK or in Germany, we also could draw a set of interviews with garment brands and retailers from the UK and from Germany that were actually pretty similar in terms of structure to the firms that didn't, and by being able to compare the ones that were not signing on, saying, we were able to understand a little bit the sort of social dynamics and mechanisms behind the formation of this initiative. We had a whole lot of other qualitative data, stakeholder interviews, attendance of industry events, documents, and so on. And the way we analyze it is actually looking at those structural characteristics. We compared the ACT firms with the non-ACT firms to see whether there were any structural characteristics like their size or their market segment that could explain this difference, but we couldn't find any. And that's when we started to really map out the process that the ACT members were explained to us of how this, and look at the social mechanisms that are running this process. And we essentially identified three interrelated but somewhat different mechanisms. The one is the role of face-to-face relations. The second is the emergence of common group understanding. And the third, which relates to the previous two, is the development of trust on the different actors signing up to this initiative. So this means trust and common understandings, both on this dimension of multiple, first of all, in the firm coordination, and trust. And both of these are really interesting developments in the context of the garment industry that has historically been, of course, extremely union adverse, and also because of this strong competitiveness, not open to any kind of coordination and cooperation with retailers. So what did we find, Sarah?
Okay, so to begin with the background to ACT, there had been a lot of contestation, or some contestation, about living wages, and H&M faced particular scrutiny. They faced journalistic inquiries, and also a campaign particularly focused on them. And in response to this, they published a living wage roadmap in 2013. However, it quickly became clear to them that they were not able to deal with the living wage issue as a single brand. Then they gradually began working with some other brands, and we saw 8 brands intervene together in Cambodia in 2018 on the living wage issue, actually lobbying the government about the level of wages in Cambodia. And in fact, all those brands later went on to become members of ACT. So it wasn't as if this came out of nowhere. On the other hand, it wasn't as if there was irresistible pressure to do something on living wages. As the quotation at the bottom of the slide says, we've been very good at saying we want to do something on wages, and then what we'll do is we'll say, oh, the NGOs have got an equation, the unions want collective bargaining, and then these two stakeholders are arguing it out, and the brand can just sit back and say, well, there's no figure. So essentially what If you remember the slide that Elke talked about earlier about the different calculations of the living wage, and you had different campaigning groups arguing for different ways of measuring the living wage, and that actually gave the brands a bit of an easy ride. They could stand back and say, oh, it's too difficult, we can't do it. And so it seemed like there wasn't pressure to do something about the living wage, which makes our puzzle about how ACT came about even more mystifying in a certain way. So that's the background. Okay, so going back to our 4 quadrants, we're thinking about how did ACT come about? Well, the first mechanism that we identified in our interview was within the Ethical Trading Initiative, that the Ethical Trading Initiative, I should say, is as I said before, a union inclusive multi-stakeholder initiative, and its governance is entirely tripartite. That is between unions, NGOs, and brands. So each of those have an equal voice. They had a so-called living wages group in which the brands were discussing within that group the problem of living wages. Living wages are actually part of the ETI base code, so all ETI members sign up for a living wage. But as they said in our interviews, we all sign up for it, but we know we don't deliver it. What we deliver are minimum wages at best, but we don't deliver living wages. Nonetheless, within this group, there's a sort of you can see common understandings emerging within this group because they're grappling with this problem and realizing that they don't have an answer to it. So that's one of the first mechanisms we identified, or the first directions. But then this is really intensified through the Bangladesh Accord, because what the Bangladesh Accord does is it demonstrates that this kind of collective action can really have an impact on the ground. So safety in Bangladesh had been a really ongoing problem. As Elke said, Rana Plaza wasn't the first disaster by any means, it was just the biggest one. And brands have been trying to do something about this for, through their codes of conduct and so on, and they hadn't really got anywhere. What happened with the Accord was it demonstrated that in fact, if brands were united, then the suppliers were pushed to actually take action. And so it demonstrated the efficacy of this mechanism of brand collective action. So it essentially increased their confidence, the brands together working within the Accord. It also, as I'll talk about in a minute, increased their confidence of working with unions. Then we also have the fact that some of the brands already had global framework agreements with industrials, so that meant that there was a certain level of confidence there as well. So we've got those 3 directions which create the trust, the face-to-face relations, and the common group understandings that Elke talked about just previously.
Okay, just to add, we also have a kind of mechanism out of ACT, which is interesting,
yes,
because 2 more framework agreements, just as a footnote, 2 more framework agreements were actually concluded between firms and unions that were members of ACT, Esprit and ASOS.
Yes, exactly.
It's just
so
a footnote.
The process continues. Thank you, Elke, for completing that slide. I missed that part off. So if we think about the inter-firm coordination, what we're saying is, in order to form a multi-firm TIRA, there are 2 elements that you need. One is the relationship between the firms, and the other is the relationship between the firms and the unions. So if we take relationships between the firms, the firms talked very compellingly about the way in which their collaboration within the Accord created what they referred to as, or one of them, the members of the firms referred to as befriended companies. And this befriending had 2 levels. On the one hand, it was institutional relations between the 2 firms, but it was also personal relationships between typically the CSR officers within those firms. So that's the face-to-face element. So you get the development of that trust. So as we said here, there's an example of it here from a UK firm saying, we started to talk about wages in the corporate group of the ETI, and then when the Accord started, we all got to know each other a bit better. So the idea arose, okay, so we can think so far and maybe even work together in wages. So you see there that mechanism of their confidence increasing and the idea that they could actually have an impact. However, as we'll come to see later, the close-knit nature of ACT founders also put some companies off. So initially, these companies that came together didn't want to invite too many people on because they didn't want to dilute the idea. They wanted to get it off the ground, but that potentially created problems further down the line that we'll come on to. Mm-hmm. If we think about the other element, which I talked about, which is the firm union coordination, that was also facilitated by the relationships which were developed, first of all, in global framework agreements, but importantly, within the Accord. So what you saw was firms talking in a kind of wide-eyed way of like, oh my goodness, you know, we really didn't think that we could deal with unions, but, you know, seeing how Industrial in particular acted within the Accord, they had this idea, oh, unions are a partner that we can work with. And they, you know, they hailed some of the industrial negotiators as, you know, genius, amazing. You know, they were really praising the unions in ways which were surprising to us. We weren't expecting to hear CSR unions hailing the benefits of, CSR officers hailing the benefits of collective bargaining, but that's what they did. Potentially also, the unions had an advantage for firms in that they weren't demanding living wages. Now they recognized that it had to be a process. So you've got a quote from one of the industrial officers here saying, it would be ridiculous for me to set deadlines and say we'll achieve this by a certain point. We're not pretending any of this is going to be delivered on soon. So perhaps that unions were seen as potentially a more patient partner than some of the NGOs or campaigning groups who were demanding living wages more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what do we make out of this then in terms of theory and explanation? So one insight we draw from it, which we think is quite important, is to highlight that there can actually be positive spillover effects across different sort of private governance CSR initiatives. And that speaks counter to some of the literature that has highlighted that there are such things like markets for standards and different initiatives that actually allow firms to forum shop, to pick sort of the CSR initiative they like most, and then have a good reason to not join other initiatives. And what we see here is a bit of a reverse effect in the sense that being part of one initiative actually can drive membership in another initiative. Of course, not in an unlimited sense, and there will always be resource constraints by firms and so on, but it's interesting that there is this potential, we think. Then we go some depth in the paper more than now into explaining what we think is special about TIRAS as a new form of multi-stakeholder initiative, because we really think we need to take the role of unions quite seriously when we look at private governance. And of course, that's actually the last point of the slide. That also leads us to a different literature that hasn't really been looked at so much in the whole private governance CSR debate, which is the industrial relations literature. Because of course, that industrial relations research has looked at the emergence of employer associations, the emergence of institutions like collective bargaining for many years. And we can actually learn a lot by looking at this literature for understanding this realm of private governance, of CSR. And then we outline the social mechanisms that support the emergence of these initiatives on a transnational level. And here we don't say we found something completely novel, because actually these mechanisms have been described by the industrial relations literature, but in the national context. Yeah. So there's a really interesting study by Behrens and Helfen, for instance, that show how the institution of social partnership that we find in countries like Germany actually are based on shared normative orientations that having it is a good thing. Yeah, and that's sort of irrespective of whether it's economically beneficial or not to have it. And what our study shows is that similar kind of mechanisms can actually develop on the transnational realm as well. And the way they happen is through existing initiatives, through interactions taking place in existing initiatives. And we also discuss and problematize, of course, the limited scalability of this mechanism. Like I said before, it's not unlimited. So one initiative will grow after the next. Firms do have resource constraints, and also limited scalability in the sense that because it was a kind of cliquey process, many firms actually felt put off in one way or other and were not included. And actually, the ACT members faced difficulties in getting more firms to join. They have solved some of these now. They did grow by some very large members in the recent months. But it has been a really hard process. And what we've learned from talking to the firms was that they've said, well, as long as we don't really have any supportive public regulation that would increase the pressure for all of us, even those that don't want to write CSR on the sort of main first page of the strategy, then we would find it much easier to actually bring these collective initiatives off the ground and implement them and make them a success. So we can't rely on this sort of friendly mechanism we outline on its own. We do need supportive regulation, and that's also an important conclusion we draw from our study. So thank you very much for listening. If you want to read some more about our research, we do have all our outputs compiled on our project website, and we also have written up a more practice-oriented stakeholder report summarizing our main findings. So thank you for listening, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.